Tonight, we're taking a closer look at the real Wild West, not the Hollywood version filled with heroic cowboys and dramatic duels, but the harsh and dangerous reality where survival was anything but guaranteed. I'm always curious where you're tuning in from, so feel free to drop a comment with your location and the time there. We're about to find out why surviving even one day in the untamed American frontier might have been harder than you expect. I love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but there's a reason they called it wild. If you're enjoying these stories, a quick like or subscribe would mean a lot. It helps more than you might think. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for a bit of background noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey. You're about to experience a legendary time in history. Welcome to the American West in the 1870s. The good news, the bad news. Your odds of making it through the day just got a lot worse. Your first challenge hits before you even open your eyes. The smell, not the fresh scent of nature, but something much stronger, the odor of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and likely raw sewage in the air. Bathing wasn't a daily habit. In fact, most people considered a full wash something you did once a month, if that. Some went entire winters without one. Water was too valuable to use for washing when it was needed for cooking and drinking. As you get out of bed, likely a straw-filled mattress crawling with bedbugs, your whole body aches. That's normal here. Life in the 1870s required constant physical work from sunrise to sunset. No weekends off, no breaks, no comfortable furniture. Whether you worked as a farmer, miner, or ranch hand, your body was your main tool, used until it wore out. You might work hard today, but on the frontier, labor meant long hours, doing intense physical tasks, plowing fields, carrying water, chopping wood, or digging deep underground. It wore people out quickly. Many were permanently hunched and arthritic by their 30s. It's no surprise the average lifespan was around 35 years. Standing on the cold, dusty floor, you feel the chill. If it's winter, your cabin might be below freezing. Most men owned only two sets, usually rough canvas or denim pants, and basic cotton shirts that irritated the skin. Hopefully you enjoy beans, biscuits, and coffee because you'll be eating that a lot. Sometimes people added eggshells or salt to tone it down. It was common to shake out boots. Each morning something learned the hard way. One bite, and you could be hours from any kind of help. Still, the caffeine helps people power through the day. The frontier diet was repetitive and lacked nutrition. Fresh produce was rare and seasonal. Meat, when available, was salted or smoked to keep it from spoiling scents. There was no refrigeration. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was common. Gums would bleed, and teeth would fall out. Women wore many layers no matter the temperature. Chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was stiff, poorly fitting, and rarely washed. Those stylish outfits from Western films, not something regular people wore. If you had a fireplace, you likely let it burn out overnight to save fuel. There's no central heating or warm clothing like we have today. And if it's summer, expect to sweat through every layer you own. There was no escape from the weather. Speaking of clothing, comfort wasn't really an option. The weather could change quickly. Snowstorms, tornadoes, flash floods, and droughts were serious threats. The clear sky above could turn deadly in no time. Your stomach growls. Time for breakfast. And that coffee. Don't expect anything close to modern brews. It was usually boiled until extremely bitter. Before heading outside, check your shoes. Scorpions or snakes might have crawled in overnight. Once you step outside, the vast landscape stretches around you. It's beautiful, yes, but also harsh. If you live near a town, you might think it offered some safety. In a few ways, it did. But towns came with their own problems. Most towns grew quickly and without structure. Buildings were put up wherever there was space. Roads were dirt paths that became deep mud in the rain or clouds of dust when dry. Without sewer systems or an understanding of germs, diseases spread in some busy areas. The waste could pile up to your knees. Flies were everywhere and helped spread disease. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could wipe out half the population. Guns were common, and disputes often ended badly. Guns were mostly tools for hunting, scaring animals, or sending signals. Medical care in the 1870s. Frontier would be shocking by modern standards. Most doctors had little to no formal training. Surgery was done without proper anesthesia, just whiskey or morphine, and there was almost no knowledge of sterilization. Even a small infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances that often caused more harm than good. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to check in their guns at the town limits. Dental care was no better. Extractions were done without anesthesia using basic tools. Many people lived with painful dental issues for years before eventually losing their teeth. Although violence by indigenous groups was far less common than popular media suggests, settlers and the U.S. military were often the aggressors. Law enforcement was limited. A single sheriff might be responsible for thousands of square miles. In many cases, justice came in the form of vigilante action, rather than official trials. Lynchings were frequent, and the idea of innocent until proven guilty didn't always apply. If accused of stealing horses or cattle, you could be executed without a trial, regardless of whether you were actually guilty. The frontier was a zone of conflict, with the forced removal of native peoples creating ongoing tensions that occasionally turned violent on both sides. On the frontier, surviving an illness or injury often came down to luck. Infections could quickly become deadly, and broken bones rarely healed well, leaving people with long-term pain or disabilities. The phrase, "only the strong survive," was quite literal in the Wild West. Wild animals like bears, wolves, and venomous snakes were real threats. Traveling unarmed between towns was risky. You head to the local eatery, which is likely just someone's home serving meals for a fee. The food isn't much different from breakfast. Meat is often tough or spoiled, even when heavily smoked or salted. Vegetables, if available, are overcooked and bland, with no food safety regulations. Dysentery and food poisoning were frequent issues. Despite what movies often show, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street were extremely rare. Most gunfights were surprise attacks or took place during robberies. The image of a skilled gunslinger facing off in a fair fight at noon is mostly a Hollywood creation. In reality, frontier violence was usually fast, unpredictable, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. Most violence wasn't planned, was chaotic, fast, and over small matters. Let's say you visit town today. It won't look like a planned city. The smell gets worse. Horse manure was everywhere. Since horses were the main form of transport, no street cleaners or sanitation crews. You walk past the saloon, likely the busiest place around. Despite movie portrayals, these weren't fancy spots with swinging doors and piano music. Most were simple rooms with rough bars and basic stools. The alcohol wasn't high-quality whiskey either. It was often raw spirits, mixed with things like tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder for extra kick. Some drinks were dangerous enough to cause blindness. Saloons also brought another risk: violence. Not staged shootouts, but sudden, deadly fights caused by arguments and too much alcohol. Everyone carried a weapon, but not just for defense against people. Interestingly, many frontier towns had strict rules about weapons. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral began because the Clanton gang refused to follow Tombstone's weapons ordinance. As you keep walking, you pass the local doctor's office. Women giving birth faced extremely high risks, with mortality rates reaching 1 in 4 in remote areas. Your stomach growls again. It's time for lunch. While you eat, you overhear talk about recent Native American attacks, outlaw gangs, and the dangers of traveling alone. Outlaws were a real threat. especially in remote regions. After lunch, you stop by the local general store for supplies. The prices are shockingly high. Basic goods cost much more here than in the eastern U.S. due to the high cost and difficulty of transportation. A single can of peaches could cost a modern equivalent of $20. Most settlers spent nearly all their money on necessities, with little left for comfort or extras. Without modern forecasts, storms arrive without warning. Blizzards could trap travelers, leading to death from exposure. Most frontier homes were quickly built, using whatever materials were available. On the plains, there were sod houses, in forests, log cabins, and in towns, simple wooden structures. Farming involved using dangerous tools with no safety features. Ranching meant handling large, unpredictable animals. It's also a chance to collect drinking water, which is hard to come by. There were no clear heroes or villains, just people trying to survive under incredibly difficult conditions. That anyone managed to do so speaks to human resilience and determination. Many settlers drank from the same sources used for bathing or watering animals. As a result, waterborne illnesses were common and could be fatal. If you survive the night, tomorrow will bring the same struggles and likely new ones. In the Wild West, nothing was promised. Survival was earned, hour by hour, through hardship that most people today can hardly imagine. Whether heading to a new settlement, joining a wagon train westward, or just exploring, travel in the 1870s was a completely different experience than it is today. By this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of the United States. The good news, long-distance travel was technically possible. The bad news, unless you were fairly wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most people on the frontier traveled by horse, wagon, or on foot. Logging was among the most hazardous professions of the time. Whatever work you did, your risk of serious injury or death was much higher than it is today. One small accident could burn your entire home down with no fire department to call. Your muscles ache, your stomach is unsettled, and your mind is drained from the constant need to stay alert. As you fall asleep, you wonder whether you'll make it through another day or if you'll become one more casualty of life on the frontier. Many frontier towns burned to the ground at least once in their history. None were particularly wet. In winter, indoor temperatures could drop below freezing. Your body is sore from the rough bed. But there's no time to rest. The Wild West waits for no one. As you stand up, memories of yesterday's trials return, and you wonder what new obstacles the day will bring. In summer, the heat, especially in upper floors or attics, was often unbearable. Tornadoes destroyed whole towns, and there were no emergency services to help. Flash floods swept away wagon trains, while droughts ruined crops and caused hunger. The store also reminds you of the isolation of frontier life. Mail was irregular and slow. Newspapers could be weeks or even months out of date. On the way, you path workers heading to the local mine. Mining was one of the deadliest jobs on the frontier. Underground collapses, toxic gases, explosions from blasting powder, and equipment failures claimed many lives. Long-term health issues were also common, like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold processing. Information moved slowly, and some settlers never heard from their families again after moving west. This isolation took a heavy emotional toll, leading to widespread depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier communities. As the afternoon goes on, dark clouds gather in the distance. Frontier weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Even if you had a proper house, it offered little protection. As the storm gets closer, you head back to your cabin. Even if you didn't work in mining, few jobs were truly safe. You reach your cabin just as the rain begins. The roof leaks in multiple places, and you place buckets around to catch the water. Sitting inside your leaky cabin, listening to the rain, you think about how different the real Wild West is from its romanticized image. Night comes early without electricity. You light a candle or oil lamp and use it sparingly. Open flame was a major fire risk. You get ready for bed, worn out from just one day. The wind howls outside, a stark reminder of how small and exposed humans are in the face of the vast wilderness. Morning light creeps through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Let's say you've decided to leave town today and travel across the frontier. What you're used to today was very different back then. If you owned a horse, you were considered fortunate. Horses were costly to buy and expensive to maintain, making them out of reach for many settlers. A decent horse could cost several months' wages. Then there were the added cost: saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care. Though veterinary care often meant putting the animal down if it broke a leg or got seriously ill. Riding a horse wasn't comfortable either. Saddles in the 1870s were made for practicality, not comfort. But forget the romantic image of cheerful pioneers crossing open plains. Wagon travel was harsh and unpleasant. After rain, they turned into deep mud pits where wagons could get stuck. It caused severe vomiting and diarrhea, killing people in just hours. Wagons weren't made to float, but many rivers had no bridges or ferries. Most deaths came from accidents: being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by animals. Accidental shootings were also frequent, as many travelers had guns, but didn't know how to use them safely. People had to float their wagons across, and many people and animals drowned, and supplies were lost. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers took many lives during these journeys. A healthy person in the morning could be dead by evening. There was no reliable treatment. Some wagon trains lost dozens during a single outbreak. Getting lost could be fatal, especially if food and water ran out. People from all over the world came here. Chinese immigrants worked on railroads, mined, and opened shops. Mexican families had lived in the Southwest long before it became U.S. land. Black cowboys made up to 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants, Germans, Irish, Italians, and Scandinavians brought their cultures, and Native American nations had lived here for thousands of years. Other illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever took many lives, especially children. A woman might plow in the morning, help deliver a baby at noon, fight off wolves in the afternoon, and still feed a family at night. In many areas, they couldn't vote, own property if married, or keep their children after a divorce. Others turned to prostitution, often out of desperation. These women faced abuse, addiction, and disease. With fewer women around, they had more choices in marriage, and sometimes better treatment. Some places, like Wyoming and Utah, even gave women voting rights, long before the rest of the country, recognizing their role in building the frontier. Even if they earned good money, they were often shunned and had few chances to change jobs. Domestic abuse was usually seen as a private matter with little legal protection. Unmarried women had few options. Teaching was one of the few acceptable jobs, though poorly paid. Female teachers were expected to quit if they married. Many women lost their husbands early and had to run farms or businesses alone. In dry weather, the dust was so thick it was hard to breathe or see. Chinese workers faced severe discrimination and had to take the most dangerous, lowest-paid jobs. The reality was complicated and varied by place. Cities usually had some form of police, but rural areas often had none. Sheriffs were elected and responsible for huge areas, sometimes thousands of square miles. They couldn't patrol regularly and relied on local volunteers during emergencies. Disease, war, forced relocation, and the destruction of food sources like buffalo wiped out many tribes. Violence usually came after repeated treaty violations and land grabs. U.S. government policy pushed Native people onto reservations, often in poor areas, by breaking treaties when resources were discovered. Native children were taken to boarding schools where their culture was erased under the slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Mexican landowners often lost their land through unfair laws or outright theft. Black Americans moved west to escape the South, but racism was still strong, just different. They were often shut out of opportunities, despite their key roles in ranching, mining, and building towns. Many families arrived with no money left and were sick or starving. Even short trips in the Wild West came with risks. Outlaws sometimes targeted lone travelers or small groups. Though stagecoach robberies were less common than later stories suggest, they did happen often enough to be a real concern. Far from helpless school teachers or damsels, they did backbreaking work while dealing with strict social rules. On farms, they handled traditional chores like cooking and childcare, but also worked in fields, took care of animals, and defended their homes. They often found the new land full of unexpected challenges. Wagons often broke down with cracked wheels or broken axles, leaving travelers stranded far from help. Wagons lacked any real suspension beyond the wooden wheels, so every bump and hole in the road was felt. Families lost children, spouses, or parents, and had to keep moving. There was no time for mourning. Delays meant risking being trapped in the mountains when snow closed the path. Stress, grief, and exhaustion caused many to suffer mental breakdowns. Heat in desert areas could cause dehydration and heat stroke. Winter storms stranded people and caused freezing deaths. In extreme cases like the Donner Party, people even resorted to cannibalism to survive. Suicide wasn't rare among those on the trail. The constant shaking caused motion sickness, leaving passengers miserable. That's roughly one grave every 350 feet across 2,000 miles. The trail was marked by crosses and stone graves, many without names because families had to bury their loved ones and keep going. Long hours in the saddle left even skilled riders with blisters and sore muscles. If your horse was startled by a snake or sudden noise which happened often, you could be thrown off and seriously injured, possibly miles away from any help. This 2,000-mile trip was one of the most dangerous journeys of the 19th century. Between the 1840s and 1860s, around 400,000 people tried to make it. About 1 in 10 didn't survive. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might use a wagon. Roads, if they existed, were usually just dirt paths made by earlier travelers. Now, let us say you decided to head all the way to California or Oregon by joining a wagon train along the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was often called the nation's longest graveyard. Some estimates suggest that 10 to 15 people died for every mile. Disease was the biggest killer. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread by dirty water, was especially deadly. Medical care was very limited, often just folk remedies that did little or made things worse. River crossings were also dangerous. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were uncommon. Most tribes were actually helpful, offering supplies and guidance. The emotional toll was high. Even if you made it to California or Oregon, your troubles weren't over. Let's say you weren't traveling that far, maybe just to the nearest town. The environment was also a constant threat. Flash floods could destroy paths or trap travelers. Navigation was also difficult. There were few maps, and travelers relied on landmarks or guides who weren't always reliable. As you travel, you start to notice something movies rarely show. The West was incredibly diverse. It wasn't just white cowboys and settlers, but diversity didn't mean equality. Racial violence was common. For Native Americans, westward expansion was devastating. From a population of around 15 million, only about 300,000 remained by 1900. Movies later portrayed cowboys and Indians as enemies. But that oversimplified reality. Many native nations tried to adapt or cooperate. You also start to think about another group, often misrepresented: frontier women. A typical day started before sunrise and ended late at night with little rest. Despite their hard work, women had few rights. Some women found ways to earn money by running boarding houses, working as nurses, or opening dressmaking shops. Still, some women did find more freedom in the West than back east. As evening comes and your journey nears its end, you might wonder how law and order worked in this supposedly lawless land. Town marshals kept order inside towns, sometimes with deputies. These jobs were risky. Some low men, like Wyatt Earp, moved between enforcing the law and operating in gray areas. Federal marshals handled serious crimes across states or territories, but there were very few of them. Bar fights, domestic disputes, and arguments over land were far more common than duels at high noon. The Hollywood idea of one brave marshal cleaning up a town was mostly fiction. Prisons did exist, but they were filthy, dangerous, and rarely used long-term. Many communities preferred quick justice to the cost of keeping prisoners. Coyotes howl, strange birds call, and the wind rustles through the trees. Unknown dangers often lurked in the darkness. While native attacks were rare, they sometimes happened at dawn when people were most defenseless. Life in the Wild West was nothing like the clean, romantic versions shown in later movies. As you wake up and stretch your sore muscles, you consider what path your frontier life might take. First, you need to stake a claim, meaning you have to find unclaimed land with possible mineral deposits. By the 1870s, this was getting harder, as the best spots were already taken. Injuries were considered normal. Medical care was basic and often didn't help. A serious injury usually meant a miner lost his job and income with no disability support. What was the reward for all this risk? Despite stories of lucky miners, most earned barely enough to survive. By the 1870s, most worked for large companies, not independently, and made just $2 to $3 a day for 10 to 12-hour shifts. Studies show that store owners, saloon keepers, and prostitutes usually made more money than the miners who kept the towns going. If you found a promising site, you'd have to register it at the nearest government office and pay fees, which could be high. Then the real work would begin, some of the hardest labor imaginable. If you tried place of mining searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend long hours, bent over in freezing water, sifting gravel with a pan or sluice box. Your hands would crack and bleed from the cold and rough work. Your back would ache from bending over all day. After all that effort, you might find just a few flakes of gold worth very little. Maybe today you'll try your luck in a growing mining town, where fortunes are said to be made overnight. Tunneling into unstable rock, without modern safety tools, often caused cave-ins that killed miners instantly. Poor ventilation allowed toxic gases like carbon monoxide to collect, odorless but deadly. Blasting with dynamite or black powder was extremely dangerous. Miners lost fingers, hands, eyes, or their lives when explosions went off too soon or sent rocks flying. The noise and shaking from blasting damaged hearing over time. Even if you avoided immediate accidents, long-term health problems were serious. Inhaling fine dust led to silicosis, lung disease that slowly suffocated people. Mercury used in gold processing caused nerve damage and mental issues. Working in copper or lead mines exposed miners to harmful metals that caused lasting illness and early death. You've heard stories of the California gold rush, Nevada's silver strikes, and Colorado's mining boom. Tales of men finding gold nuggets as big as eggs and getting rich overnight attracted hundreds of thousands west. But those stories left out the harsh realities of chasing mineral wealth. It was hard, dangerous, and far more uncomfortable than most modern people could handle. The required skills, from navigating without maps to making repairs and handling guns, took years to learn. Mistakes were often deadly. As night falls and the sounds of animals grow louder, you wonder what tomorrow will bring. If you survive the night, maybe you'll get closer to your goal, or maybe you'll end up as another forgotten grave by the trail, one more casualty of westward expansion. The Wild West tolerated no weakness and gave no second chances. Simply surviving each day was a small victory against great odds. Predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions might approach camps in search of food. Venomous snakes and scorpions often looked for warm places to rest, sometimes inside a traveler's bed. Even without actual threats, the constant stress of staying alert was exhausting. Frontier diaries often mention fatigue caused not only by hard work, but by the mental burden of always being on guard. Today, people who rely on locks, alarms, and living in populated areas might find frontier sleeping conditions extremely unsettling. For people used to city lights and noise, the total darkness and unfamiliar sounds of the frontier night could be deeply unsettling. In remote areas, people often took justice into their own hands. Vigilante groups formed to deal with threats, when official help wasn't available. Sometimes they helped, but they could also become tools for revenge or prejudice. The famous quick-draw gunfight was mostly made up. Most violence was sudden and fueled by alcohol. Don't expect comfort. Rooms were basic. A bed, a washstand, maybe a chair. This meant building a fire if you could find fuel, cooking from limited supplies, and sleeping outside with little protection. Experienced travelers, native peoples, and scouts had good camping techniques, but many settlers made dangerous mistakes. A fire that was too big could start a massive blaze. One too small might not keep you warm. Cooking over a fire was difficult, and meals were often partly burned and partly raw. Bathrooms were shared. Walls were thin, so you'd hear everything your neighbor did. In busy times, you might even have to share a bed with a stranger. Sheets weren't always changed, and lighting came from candles or oil lamps. A room cost 25 cents to $1, a big expense for many. To save money, some people slept in barns or under the stars. Even with the extra risks, punishments were severe. Hanging was common for murder, rape, and sometimes theft. As night falls and you look for a place to stay, you might find a hotel or boarding house if you're lucky. If you were in a remote area, you'd camp. As you lie down to sleep, the sounds of the wilderness take over. Many travelers on the frontier struggled to sleep, not just due to physical discomfort, but because of fear. As you start to drift off, you reflect on the day's journey. The sun rises over the frontier, and you've made it through the night, an accomplishment in itself. If you decide to become a miner, what would that involve? If you chose hard rock mining, digging into mountains for ore, the risks grew even more. Mining in the 1870s had almost no safety rules. Mine owners focused on profits, not worker safety. Mining towns were known for being rough places. Picture a town made up mostly of young, single men doing dangerous work, with few women, families, or social institutions. Alcohol use was very high. Camp residents drank much more than people do today. Violence was common, with frequent fights, stabbings, and shootings. Sanitation was often poor, with little infrastructure. Human waste and garbage filled the streets and waterways. Diseases like typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread quickly. In warmer months, the smell was awful, and flies carried disease from waste to food. If you found valuable or cashing it in brought more problems. Banking in the Wild West was underdeveloped and often exploitative. Many mining towns had no banks, so miners carried gold dust or ore, making them easy robbery targets. Saloons and stores sometimes bought gold but at unfair prices, taking advantage of miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they were barely regulated. Bank failures were common and wiped out savings with no warning or compensation. Some so-called banks were scams, collecting deposits and disappearing. Paper money wasn't federally backed, so individual banks printed their own, and its value varied depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills were common, and even skilled merchants could be fooled. Gold and silver coins were the safest, but carrying them made you a target. After all this, maybe you consider ranching instead. The cattle business was growing in the 1870s, with high demand for beef in eastern cities. Surely this would be safer and more profitable. Ranching did avoid mining's worst health risks, but it came with its own challenges. Starting a ranch required a lot of money. Livestock, tools, and buildings were all expensive. Many would-be ranchers took on heavy debt, gambling on good weather and markets, but nature was often unkind. Droughts dried out grasslands and water supplies, forcing ranchers to sell cattle at major losses or watch them starve. Severe winters could wipe out entire herds, as in the Great Dup of 1886 to 87, when up to 90% of northern cattle died from the cold. Disease could spread quickly through herds, destroying a rancher's investment overnight. There were no effective treatments for illnesses like Texas fever or anthrax. Predators like wolves and cougars killed livestock, especially calves. Poisonous plants, mud pits, and injuries also reduced herds. The famous cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroads, were not glamorous adventures, but hard and dangerous work. Cowboys, far from the romantic image in movies, were mostly young, underpaid workers. During drives, they worked 20-hour days, catching brief naps on horseback while guiding thousands of cattle across rough land. Drives faced constant risks. River crossings could turn deadly in moments if animals panicked. Stampedes caused by something as simple as lightning or a snapping twig sent thousands of 1,500-pound animals running wild. Cowboys caught in them were often trampled. Life as a cowboy was far from free or easy. Most earned about $30 a month for risky, exhausting work. Many were teenagers from poor families with no other choices. A large number were black, Mexican, or mixed-race men who faced discrimination. Their trail diet was basic beans, salted pork, and biscuits, with little fresh food. Medical care was limited to what the cook knew about home remedies. Injuries, common in this line of work, often became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence, so maybe ranching isn't the answer. What about farming? Growing food, the most basic human task, should be more stable and less risky. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened large areas of the West to settlers, offering 160 acres free to anyone who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. It sounded like a great chance people with little money could own land and build independent lives. In reality, it was much harder. Though 160 acres seems like a lot, in the dry regions of the West, it often wasn't enough to support a family. Traditional farming methods from the East didn't work well in these dry areas, which got much less rain than settlers were used to. Many pioneers lacked the dry farming knowledge needed to succeed. Starting a frontier farm took enormous physical effort. The first priority was building shelter, usually a sod house made from cutting and stacking thick prairie grass. These sod homes were dark, damp, and prone to leaking during rain. They attracted insects and snakes and required constant upkeep to stay intact. Next came the exhausting task of preparing land for crops. The prairie's tough grass roots, developed over centuries, made the soil very hard to plow with the tools. Most settlers had clearing just a few acres could take over a year. The labor was so intense, it caused lasting damage to many farmers' bodies. Once crops were planted, threats came from all sides. Drought could dry out fields, while heavy rains might wash away young plants or flood the land. An early frost could kill crops just before harvest. Swarms of grasshoppers often appeared in huge numbers, eating everything green and even chewing on tool handles. Disease was another major concern. With no hired help and little community support, sickness during planting or harvest season could mean starvation. Women often worked the fields while heavily pregnant or shortly after giving birth, putting their health at risk because the work couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often deadly. Homemade tools broke, causing injuries. Animals could panic and trample handlers. Even after a good harvest, danger remained. Some farmers died after falling into grain bins and suffocating, or when weak storage buildings collapsed. The isolation of frontier life also took a toll. Neighbors might live miles apart and be seen only rarely. Women, in particular, went months without speaking to anyone outside their family. This loneliness led to depression, anxiety, and what was then called prairie madness, sometimes resulting in abandonment or suicide. Those who managed to grow crops still faced financial hurdles. Transporting goods to market was expensive and difficult. Perishable foods had to be sold quickly or preserved without refrigeration. Large agricultural companies and railroads kept crop prices low and transport fees high, putting small farmers in a tough spot. By the 1870s, some people turned to wage work in nearby towns and industries, hoping for a safer and more stable path than farming, mining, or ranching. While wage labor avoided some of the physical and financial risks of independent work, it had its own dangers. Industrial safety rules were nearly non-existent. Factory and mill workers were injured by exposed machinery. Construction crews worked on tall structures without safety gear, leading to deadly falls. Railroad work was especially dangerous. Track Layers worked in brutal conditions with little equipment. Many died from heat stroke, exhaustion, or accidents. Chinese laborers, who built much of the transcontinental railroad, were often given the riskiest tasks, including handling unstable explosives. Workdays were long 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week, and pay was low. Most workers earned barely enough to survive. Child labor was common. Kids as young as 8 worked alongside adults, often getting hurt due to their size and inexperience. Workers had few rights. Employers could fire anyone without reason, cut pay at will, or withhold wages entirely. Those who spoke out or tried to organize risked blacklisting, meaning no other employer in the area would hire them. In mining and lumber areas, company towns were common. One company owned the housing, stores, and often paid workers in scrip company currency instead of real money. Prices were inflated, keeping workers in debt and unable to leave. No matter the job, farming, ranching, mining, or wage work, life on the frontier shaped people in ways modern society would find hard to imagine. Time was experienced differently on the frontier. It wasn't ruled by clocks and schedules, but by sunlight, seasons, and daily needs. Without electric lights, people woke at sunrise and slept soon after dark. Work didn't follow 8-hour shifts, but depended on what needed to be done, moving cattle or harvesting crops. During harvest or roundup, people might work from dawn until nightfall for weeks straight. Winters were quieter, with less work needed on dormant fields or livestock. Punctuality wasn't important in most daily life. With few clocks, people used rough time references like after breakfast or before sunset. Stagecoaches and later trains introduced more precise timing, but only in specific contexts. Leisure looked very different too. After long workdays, people had little energy for complex activities. Evenings often involved sitting by the fire, telling stories, playing cards, or listening to music when instruments were available. Fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars were used for dances. Books and newspapers were rare and shared among neighbors, often read until they wore out. Organized sports existed, though simpler than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with basic gear on makeshift fields. Horse races, wrestling, and shooting contests were common and served as both fun and skill tests. Children played games needing little or no equipment, tag, hide and seek, or makeshift stickball. Holidays and community events were major social opportunities. Independence Day celebrations drew people from miles around for food, speeches, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the end of critical work. Religious holidays gave both spiritual meaning and a break from routine. As night falls, you reflect on the intense demands of frontier life. Everything required more effort, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than today. Those who lived through it needed physical strength, practical skills, and mental toughness. As darkness sets in, you hear only the wind, insects, and distant night birds. This deep quiet, strange to modern ears, was the nightly soundscape. It could be peaceful or unsettling as you drift towards sleep. You wonder, could you have endured this life, not just briefly, but for decades? The real people who settled the American West weren't romanticized heroes, but individuals meeting immense challenges with limited resources. Their story, stripped of myth, is one of endurance. The cool night wraps around you, and the stars emerge in brilliance, sun-matched by light-polluted modern skies. This was one beauty frontier people experienced that few today can. The breathtaking arc of the Milky Way, a connection to generations past. Morning returns to the Wild West, and with it, hunger. On the frontier, feeding yourself in the 1870s was nothing like the modern convenience of today's diets. The good news, wild game like deer, elk, rabbits, and birds was still available. The bad news, hunting required ammunition, which was costly and often needed for defense. Hunting also took time away from other crucial tasks, making it a rare option during busy seasons. Most families relied on what they could grow, preserve, or buy in bulk. Their main foods were beans, corn, and pork, high in calories, but repetitive, and lacking full nutrition. Fresh produce was seasonal, available for only a few months. Winter diets often had no fresh fruits or vegetables at all. This led to common nutritional issues. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was widespread in late winter and spring. Symptoms included bleeding gums, loose teeth, joint pain, and sometimes death. Other deficiencies stunted children's growth and caused long-term health problems. Preserving food was essential and time-consuming. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten quickly or preserved by smoking, salting, or drying. These methods changed flavor and texture and reduced nutrition. Salt-heavy diets raised health concerns. Women spent many hours preserving food when it was available to use during lean times. Vegetables were pickled or fermented. Fruits were dried or canned with sugar, when possible. Root vegetables were stored in cool, underground cellars. These tasks weren't optional. They meant the difference between eating and going hungry. Food storage brought more problems. When preservation was done right, food could last months. When done poorly, it spoiled or caused illness. Pests like rats and insects ate stored supplies and contaminated the rest. Most families accepted a certain amount of contamination as unavoidable. Insect parts or rodent droppings in flour or beans were simply part of life. Cooking was also much harder than today. Meals were made over open fires or wood-burning stoves, which required constant fuel and attention. In treeless areas, women and children gathered dried manure or twisted grass for fuel. Water had to be hauled in buckets from wells or streams, hundreds of pounds per day for drinking, cooking, and washing. Despite all this work, meals remained simple and bland. Spices were rare and used sparingly. Sugar and coffee were treasured and saved for special days. Milk was only available if a family had a canned only when it was producing. Most children grew up on dull, repetitive diets that would concern modern nutritionists. Yet, despite the plain food, obesity was uncommon. Limited food, little sugar, and constant physical labor kept people lean. Still, many were malnourished even while consuming enough calories. But beyond survival, raising children on the frontier came with its own difficulties. Childhood was viewed differently in the 19th century. Kids as young as 6 did real work vital to family survival. Not chores, but necessary tasks. They tended animals, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, and watched siblings. By age 10 or 12, most children worked nearly like adults. Boys followed their fathers into fields or shops, learning by doing. Girls helped their mothers with complex household tasks like preserving food, making soap, and sewing clothes. Children weren't shielded from harsh realities. They saw births, deaths, animal slaughter, and sometimes violence in their communities. They were expected to learn and adapt, not be protected. Formal education was limited and irregular. In towns, schools might run only in winter. When farming was slow, a single, minimally trained teacher might teach kids aged 5 to 17 in one room. School conditions were rough. Buildings were cold in winter and hot in summer. Supplies were few, maybe shared textbooks and slates to write on. Paper was scarce and treated as precious. Discipline was strict, with physical punishment for even small misbehavior. In remote areas, there were often no schools. Some families taught at home with whatever books they had. Many kids only learned basic reading and arithmetic. Their education focused on practical knowledge, reading the weather, tracking animals, planting crops, and handling injuries. Child death rates were very high. Around 1 in 4 children didn't survive to adulthood. The first 5 years were the most dangerous. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough often killed or disabled young children. Many died in accidents. As safety wasn't a major concern in an environment where survival often meant taking risks. The emotional impact of this loss is hard for modern people to grasp. Children grew up seeing siblings die. Parents expected to lose children and often reused names for younger siblings if one died early. Though strange today, this reflected how common death was. Perhaps no contrast between frontier and modern life is greater than how people understood health and medicine. If you became sick or injured in the 1870s West, your experience would be almost nothing like modern healthcare. The first major difference was the lack of professional medical care in most situations. Doctors were rare, and many communities had none at all. Those who did practice on the frontier often had very little training, maybe just a short apprenticeship or a few months at a medical school. Their medical knowledge reflected the science of the time, which still relied heavily on outdated ideas like humoral balance, more similar to medieval thinking than modern medicine. Without access to trained doctors, most health issues were treated at home using folk remedies. Every community had individuals, usually women known for their healing abilities, using traditions passed down from different cultures. Some of these treatments, especially herbal ones, had real medical value, but many others were useless or even harmful. Common practices included bloodletting, which weakened already sick patients, purgatives that caused extreme diarrhea to flush out bad humors, and poultices made from various substances, some of which caused infection instead of preventing it. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was widely used for pain, leading to many cases of addiction. Mercury-based medicines were also prescribed for several conditions, despite being poisonous. Even when a treatment had some benefit, poor-quality drugs often made things worse. Without any regulation, over-the-counter medicines varied greatly in strength and often contained dangerous substances. Many patent medicines advertised as cures were mostly alcohol, giving only brief relief through intoxication rather than real healing. Surgery under frontier conditions was especially brutal. There was little effective anesthesia besides alcohol, whiskey, or opium, so patients endured extreme pain. Sterilization was either unknown or poorly practiced, leading to many post-surgery infections. Amputation was the standard treatment for severe limb injuries, done with saws and knives that might be wiped off but never properly cleaned. Childbirth showed perhaps the biggest gap between frontier life and modern healthcare. Most women gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was available, or by female relatives if not. Without prenatal care, many problems weren't noticed until labor had already begun. Breech births, heavy bleeding, and other emergencies that modern doctors handle icily often led to the death of the mother, baby, or both. On the frontier, about one woman died for every 100 births, over 100 times. Today's rate in developed countries, many women entered pregnancy knowing it might cost them their life. Men's diaries and letters from the time often mention the deep sorrow of raising children after their wives died in childbirth. The combination of poor nutrition, non-stop hard labor, little preventive care, and crude medical treatments meant people on the frontier had health outcomes more like those in developing countries today. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years. Even those who survived childhood often suffered from long-term health problems by their 50s if they lived that long. Besides physical hardships, frontier life created a kind of isolation and disconnection that modern people used to instant communication would find nearly unbearable. This isolation deeply affected frontier psychology and culture. Communication with distant relatives or friends depended on physical travel. Letters could take weeks or months to arrive if they arrived at all. News moved slowly and was often distorted as it passed from person to person. Major events might not reach remote areas for months. This information gap led to a narrow, local focus. Distant news felt far less important than the daily concerns of one's own community. The isolation was especially hard for people who came from more settled areas. Women who had once enjoyed close friendships and family networks often found themselves alone for days or weeks. When their husbands left to get supplies or look for work, their journals often describe intense loneliness and the emotional burden of having no adult conversation for long periods. This isolation sometimes caused what people then called prairie madness, serious depression, anxiety, and occasionally psychosis brought on by constant work, solitude, and the harsh environment. Some people affected by it became violent toward loved ones or took their own lives. Others simply gave up, leaving their homesteads and returning east, unable to handle the mental strain of frontier life. Even in more settled areas, social ties were limited by basic obstacles. Visiting a neighbor could mean walking or riding several miles each way, a big effort. When time was limited and transport was slow, organized social events were rare and usually connected to religious services, seasonal holidays, or shared work like barn raisings and harvests. Churches were vital in frontier life, going far beyond religious services. They acted as social centers, schools, and sources of community support. Even people who weren't strongly religious often took part in church activities for the connection they offered. Ministers, priests, or local preachers often served as teachers, conflict mediators, and community leaders. The founding of institutions like schools, churches, or meeting halls marked key moments in the growth of frontier towns. These buildings showed a shift from temporary settlements to lasting communities. Over time, the creation of local governments, even basic ones, showed the change from lawless frontier living to organized town life. Frontier communities also created unique systems of mutual help needed to survive in such tough conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings let neighbors help each other with large building projects no single family could finish alone. Groups moved from farm to farm at harvest time to help gather crops before bad weather hit. If a child went missing, neighbors quickly formed search parties. These cooperative habits reflected the reality that no one could survive the frontier alone. Despite the popular idea of total self-reliance, people depended on one another for major tasks. Both independence and teamwork were essential to life in the West. Self-reliance helped people get through each day. Community support helped them face challenges too big for one person. This balance shaped frontier culture and continues to influence how Americans think about government, community, and personal responsibility today. As another day in the wild West ends, you begin to reflect on the mental and emotional strength it took to live under these conditions year after year. The people who settled the frontier weren't superhuman. They struggled, suffered, and sometimes gave in to the pressure of their world. But many learned to adapt and endured, developing skills, habits, and beliefs that gave meaning and even joy in a life filled with hardship. As night falls again, the deep quiet of a world without engines or electricity surrounds you. The day's experiences offer a rare glimpse into a past that feels both familiar and distant. A world where survival took constant work, comfort was rare, and death was part of daily life. As sleep nears, you wonder about the people who chose this life or were pushed into it by circumstance. What drove them west? What gave them the strength to face blizzards, droughts, illness, and grief? What would they think of the modern world that came from their sacrifices? They built that world through hard labor and constant setbacks, often without knowing what future their efforts would create. The questions stay with you into your dreams, filled with wide plains, tall mountains, and the faces of people who built the West, not with gunfights, but with quiet determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Their story, without myths or Hollywood flair, shows the power of everyday courage and human adaptability. Dawn rises on your last day in the Wild West. As sunlight spreads across the landscape, you pause to admire the raw beauty that pulled so many people westward. Despite the danger and struggle, the frontier was a place of amazing natural wonder. Endless grasslands rippling in the wind, mountains towering into the sky, canyons plunging deep into the earth. This beauty was no myth. But even people's relationship with nature was very different from modern views. Frontier settlers mostly saw the land as something to use, not protect. Forests were cut down without concern for regrowth. Wild animals were hunted to near extinction in many places. Streams were redirected or polluted for mining, with no thought for downstream damage. The near extinction of the American bison, also known as buffaloes, one of the clearest examples of this harmful use of nature. In the 1700s, there were around 30 to 60 million bison in North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This loss wasn't just caused by hunting for food or hides. It was also part of a plan, encouraged by the U.S. government, to destroy the main food source of Plains Indian tribes, forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader during the Plains Indian Wars, is often quoted as saying, "Let them kill, skin day, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he actually used these exact words, they reflect the official government policy of the time. The destruction of buffalo herds functioned as a form of environmental warfare, meant to break Native resistance by removing their main resource for Native American nations across the West. The spread of white settlement brought not just displacement, but the destruction of economic systems, spiritual traditions, and cultural identities rooted in specific landscapes and resources, while early encounters sometimes included trade and cooperation. By the 1870s, most Native groups faced stark options: confinement to reservations, continued resistance against overwhelming odds, or cultural assimilation. The reservation system itself was a form of cultural erasure. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. As Captain Richard H. Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, notoriously put it, these children had their hair cut, were banned from speaking their languages, and were not allowed to practice their religions or preserve their cultural identities. The trauma from these policies continues to affect Native communities today. Armed resistance to American expansion almost always ended in defeat, though some groups held out longer than others. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where Allied Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces defeated Lt. Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, was one of the last major Native victories. In the aftermath, U.S. military campaigns became increasingly brutal, targeting villages and killing women and children. This tragic cultural conflict was compounded by the fact that many Native nations had well-developed agricultural systems, complex forms of governance, and rich cultural traditions that might have offered meaningful contributions to settler society. But fundamental differences in land use and ownership led to deep misunderstandings. Many Native groups didn't see land as something to be owned any more than the sky or stars, making treaties over territory problematic from the beginning. These cultural conflicts weren't limited to Native-settler relations. The American West was incredibly diverse, shaped by communities from around the world, bringing varied languages, religions, customs, and approaches to frontier life. This diversity was a strength, introducing new skills and perspectives, but also a source of tension in places with limited resources and infrastructure. Chinese immigrants, essential to railroad construction and mining operations, faced especially harsh discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major U.S. immigration restriction based on nationality, grew out of anti-Chinese sentiment that had long existed in Western territories. Chinese miners were often driven from valuable claims through violence or by unfair enforcement of foreign miners' taxes. Entire Chinese communities faced riots or were expelled during periods of economic downturn. Mexican Americans, many of whom became U.S. citizens through territorial annexation rather than immigration, also faced discrimination and land loss. Despite treaty guarantees protecting property rights after the Mexican-American War, many lost their land through legal manipulation, threats, or outright fraud. Water rights systems based on Spanish law, which had functioned well in arid regions, were replaced by English common law frameworks less suited to local conditions. Even European immigrants encountered challenges. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, and Eastern European Jews tended to settle in distinct communities, maintaining their traditions. These networks provided support, but could also become targets of nativist backlash during times of economic or social stress. African Americans, who moved west after the Civil War, sought relief from Southern oppression but often faced different forms of racism. Black cowboys made up about 25% of workers on some ranches, but received little recognition in popular accounts or later myths. Black homesteaders formed communities in various territories, but regularly met resistance from white settlers and bias in the enforcement of land laws. The meeting of so many diverse groups, each with their own values and traditions, made for frontier communities that were much more complex and conflicted than later romanticized versions suggest. The melting pot metaphor, popular in American history, often obscures the persistent cultural differences and the power dynamics that determine which cultures survived and which were suppressed. As the day progresses, you find yourself in a frontier town undergoing rapid job pattern that was reshaping much of the West during the 1870s and 1880s. The early phase of settlement, dominated by individual prospectors, small farmers, and independent businesses, giving way to corporate development and industrial-scale resource extraction. Railroads played a central role in this shift. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, cut travel time between the coasts from months to days. Branch lines soon reached remote areas, linking them to national markets and supply routes. This transportation revolution allowed massive resource extraction for Eastern factories and brought factory-made goods to the frontier. These economic links sped up the West's integration into national systems, but often at the expense of small producers. Independent miners struggled to compete with corporations using industrial tools and large investments. Family farms were challenged by commercial agriculture on vast tracts of land. Small ranchers were squeezed out by powerful cattle companies with access to capital and political influence. Corporate interests also began to dominate politics. Railroad firms, mining companies, timber businesses, and wealthy landowners wielded strong influence over local and territorial governments. Water rights, mineral claims, grazing lands, and timber permits were usually granted to those with wealth and connections, not to small landowners or community members. This transition wasn't only economic, it was cultural. Once rough mining camps and cattle towns began to take on the look and structure of permanent communities. Banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and civic organizations appeared. Streets were planned, sometimes paved. Wooden buildings gave way to brick or stone. Local governments passed laws regulating daily life, where once there had been little formal authority. For some settlers, drawn to the frontier by its freedom from Eastern norms, these changes felt like unwanted domestication. Some simply kept moving west, seeking new frontiers. Others stayed, but struggled to adjust to growing regulation, competition, and changing social norms. The closing of the frontier, as declared in the 1890 census, was not just a demographic shift, it was a cultural and psychological one. Many who had built identities around frontier life now faced a world where that lifestyle was vanishing. Part of this transformation included efforts to manage frontier violence. The famous gunfighters and outlaws who became staples of Western mythology lived in a transitional era when formal law enforcement was just taking root. By the 1880s and 1890s, professional police forces and court systems had largely replaced vigilante justice in settled areas. Though isolated, communities still saw occasional flare-ups of old-style conflict. The legendary figures who captured the public imagination, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, lived complicated, often morally ambiguous lives. They operated on both sides of the law as circumstances shifted. The myths later built around them simplified and exaggerated these lives. Hickok, far from the flawless gunslinger of legend, accidentally shot bystanders in at least 2 gunfights. Earp worked at different times as a lawman, gambler, saloon-keeper, and vigilante. Jesse James' Robin Hood image ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the civilian casualties of his robberies. As night falls on your final day in the Wild West, you reflect on the wide gap between historical reality and the mythology that followed. Why did Americans and, eventually the world, embrace a romanticized version of this often brutal era. What needs did these myths fulfill, and what truths did they conceal? The most intense period of frontier myth-making happened just as the actual frontier was disappearing. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows began in the 1880s, featuring staged battles and stagecoach robberies for Eastern audiences even as railroads, telegraph lines, and formal governments were steadily integrating Western regions into mainstream American life. These performances weren't meant to be accurate history, but rather entertainment that matched Eastern fantasies about the West. The dime novels that spread exaggerated tales of Western heroes also came not from the frontier, but from Eastern publishing houses. Most were written by authors who had never seen the West firsthand. These formulaic stories focused on action, clear moral lines between heroes and villains, and a vision of the West as a proving ground for American virtues like self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Later, Hollywood Westerns further shaped and spread these myths, creating iconic images of lone cowboys, heroic sheriffs, evil outlaws, and savage Indians that bore little resemblance to historical reality. These films did more than entertain. They served cultural and psychological roles. They offered comforting stories about American identity during times of rapid social change and global challenges. The mythology suggested that America's unique character was shaped by the frontier-producing qualities that set the nation apart from older societies. It implied that westward expansion was not just inevitable, but morally right, a triumph of civilization over wilderness, of progress over primitive cultures. But these myths hid the complex, morally messy reality of Western development, the genocide of native peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the destruction of the environment, the political power of corporations, and the struggles of deeply divided communities. The real West didn't offer simple lessons. It was a place where human societies adapted in ways both inspiring and brutal, sometimes cooperating to overcome challenges, sometimes descending into violence and greed. As darkness falls once more, you reflect on your short time in the Wild West. You've come to understand why someone today used too easy access to food, medical care, and modern comforts would likely not last a single day in the real frontier of the 1870s. Surviving there required skills, knowledge, physical strength, and mental toughness few modern people possess. And yet, the world of the frontier still fascinates. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a life stripped down to essentials, where effort had immediate consequences and success was a real, tangible victory. Perhaps it's the sense of community that came from shared hardship, creating bonds that crossed backgrounds and beliefs. Or maybe it's simply the reminder that people can endure and even thrive under conditions much harder than we face today. The legacy of the American frontier goes beyond myth. It lives in the laws, systems, and debates that shape modern American life: property rights, water law, federal-state relationships, and approaches to land and natural resources. The cultural diversity of the West, despite forced assimilation efforts, helped shape today's multicultural America. Even current tensions between individual freedom and collective good, between local and national control, between exploitation and conservation, have roots in frontier debates. For native peoples, the frontier wasn't a tale of national greatness, but a time of destruction and loss. It marked the end of ancient lifeways and the beginning of a long fight for cultural survival and sovereignty. Their perspective reminds us that the triumphalist story of Western settlement leaves out the deep civilizations that were already there, and the immense knowledge lost through their displacement. Understanding the frontier means holding multiple truths at once. It means seeing both the bravery of those who built new lives and the suffering of those who were pushed aside. As you drift toward sleep on your final night in the West, the sounds of that era surround you: wind rustling through prairie grass, the distant howl of a coyote, perhaps the faint sound of a piano from a saloon. These sensations connected everyone who lived in that time, no matter their background. The vast skies, harsh weather, and raw landscapes shaped all who encountered them. creating a shared experience amid great cultural conflict. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this turning point in American history. You'll never see a Western film or read a frontier novel the same way again, now recognizing the myths for what they are. You'll appreciate the comfort and security of modern life, built on technology unimaginable to those who came before. You might even become more aware of the knowledge we've lost in our move toward specialization and dependence on machines. The self-sufficiency that once allowed people to build, repair, grow, preserve, and create with their own hands. Most importantly, you'll know that the true story of the West isn't found in shootouts or gold strikes, but in the daily lives of ordinary people, men, women, and children of many backgrounds who faced huge challenges with limited resources. Their story, without the gloss of Hollywood, holds enough courage, loss, invention, conflict, kindness, and cruelty to fill volumes. Their legacy lives on in the towns they built, the landscapes they changed, the traditions they started, and the myths that followed. The Wild West is long gone, replaced by cities, highways, and managed land, but its echoes remain in regional identity, local customs, land laws, and the national imagination. Even now, as scholars and communities work to replace one-sided myths with more complete and inclusive histories, the memory of the frontier continues to shape how Americans see themselves. And as you finally fall asleep, the line between past and present fades. The problems frontier communities faced: how to live with nature's limits, how to share scarce resources, how to form societies from many cultures, how to balance freedom with order are still with us, just in new forms. Maybe the real legacy of the frontier isn't a set of answers, but a set of questions. Questions each generation must ask again as the world changes, and gave homesick immigrants a sense of continuity with their old lives. In this moment, you feel a quiet kinship with those who once looked up at these same constellations, wondering, just like you, what tomorrow would bring. In a world where nothing was guaranteed, but where life, in all its hardship and beauty, was lived with a depth few of us today will ever know. Above you, the stars shine, the same stars that once guided wagon trains, helped farmers time their crops, a place where human weakness and strength lived side by side, where different peoples clashed and sometimes cooperated, shaping a nation, and where, in the fight for survival, people found moments of meaning and connection that still echo through the ages. Sleep comes at last in with it. Dreams of a West both harsh and magnificent.